Okay, we're on page 58. This is our review of intellectual trends. So we will have encountered these before, but now we're just sort of going along across throughout the history, but just tracing how these ideas develop. Okay, so the ancient ideas of Plato and Aristotle, this is before actually what we're covering. So we don't need to go into them in much detail. Just know that they're these early philosophers, and Plato has his notion of the philosophy of the forms, that there's these ideal forms that exist, and everything here in the world is some reproduction of those ideal models. And so Plato, discussing the ideal, like in his Republic, Plato believes that there can be an ideal republic in which everyone has a position based on their talent or their skills. The workers, the merchants, and then the leaders, and those leaders would be the philosophers, the philosopher kings. Aristotle is more relevant, so we'll talk a little more about him. Aristotle is more focused on actually looking at things in the world. And so he's a philosopher and scientist, what we call today a scientist. At the time, that term doesn't exist. And so he's looking to classify things and look at what things are made of and how things change from one thing to the next, and how making these observations about the world. And specifically for our sake, Aristotle makes these observations, for example, that the earth is the center, and these things are moving around the earth. And we know this, Aristotle thinks, because when we look at how objects move, an object here on earth is seeking the center, it's seeking its natural place of rest, right? And so it goes right down to the middle of the earth, right? If you dug a hole underneath the building, it would keep going down until it reached that center of the earth. And so therefore the earth has to be the center of the universe, right? And in his opinion, the earth is a stationary round planet around which all these ideal forms, these circles, these spheres in which these other things are rotating, like the sun and the moon, these are all going around the earth. And of course, not mentioned there, but discussed at length in the section on the scientific revolution is Ptolemy, who builds on that, right? And he says that there's these crystalline spheres that are holding these heavenly orbs. These ancient thinkers don't think that these are planets like Earth, or that they're three-dimensional objects that have ecosystems, or not ecosystems because things don't live there, but sort of environments and environmental conditions like we have here on Earth. So there's just this notion that there are these perfect heavenly spheres, these heavenly orbs, circular things, rotating around the Earth in these perfect crystalline spheres in perfect circles. And this is just the ancient thinking. Now, during the Middle Ages, much of that philosophy of the ancient Greeks is lost to Western Europe. And much of it is maintained in the East, the Eastern Europe, the Orthodox Byzantine Empire, and of course in the Middle East, in the Arab Empire, and in Northern Africa. But in the mid-Middle Ages, some of this knowledge begins to come back into Europe, and so the thinker Thomas Aquinas plays this big role in Middle Age. He's the big Middle Age philosopher. And what Aquinas does is he reconciles the Aristotelian philosophy about the earth being the center, about how there is a prime mover, this first thing that set all these spheres in motion. And he reconciles this with, of course, the biblical accounts, the Christian accounts. And for Aquinas, the theological beliefs of the Bible and Christianity are reaffirmed by looking at nature and by looking at these discoveries of these ancient philosophers. In other words, there's two ways to come to truth, but you come to the same truth. Truth through revelation and truth through natural observation. And so this is the beginning of this concept of natural law, that from nature you can deduce truths not just about nature, but about God and these bigger things. And so Aquinas is what we call a scholastic. And scholastics during the Middle Ages, it's important to note that all of the learning going on during the Middle Ages, most of it is happening within church institutions. Who are the people that can write and read and can publish books, like actually rewrite books and send them on, right? There is no printing press, so every book is being sort of written out. And that's why you have these elaborate manuscripts and beautiful Bibles, is because they're being handwritten. And so who has the ability to do that? Well, church officials, monks and other priests. They're the ones that are educated. They're the ones that have access to information. And the educational institutions are these church universities, right? The Cambridges and Oxfords, all of the major universities, the centers of learning, are run by the church. And the major things that are studied there are theology, as well as math, and what else? Medicine, to some degree. But what we don't see being studied at the universities in the Middle Ages, we don't see at all what today is called the liberal arts. We don't see literature being studied. We don't see humanities. The humanities are the things that are not there. Literature is not being studied. Rhetoric and how language can be used. And so that's what comes from the Renaissance. And so we'll talk about that in a second. So scholasticism is it's a way of learning from the Middle Ages in which basic truths are used, and from those truths, new things are deduced. And so it uses deductive reasoning. And so you have, this is true. God created man in his image. And so from that, we can deduce all sorts of things about the relationship of man to God, the nature of human beings, because we know this truth that we were created in God's image. And likewise, all sorts of things are deduced from these known truths. And that, of course, will be challenged. That way of thinking will be challenged during the scientific revolution. Now, the Renaissance, we mentioned, it's important because it's this amazing intellectual and cultural movement that occurs. Now, obviously, some historians think that it's overemphasized. But Jacob Burckhardt is the historian that comes up with this thesis that basically the Renaissance is this moment where people, in his opinion, lift that veil of religion and of superstition and begin to see themselves as individuals and begin to see the world as it really is. Now, other historians point out that the Renaissance is not this giant rebirth.
Will Escona come to the athletic secretary's office? Will Escona come to Miss Sheehan's office?
The Renaissance is not a rebirth of politics. We've got the same political entities, the same royal families, the same feudal obligations. The Renaissance is not a rebirth of economics. The economy of Italy is a source of the wealth that allows for the learning and art of the Renaissance, but the Renaissance doesn't cause it. In fact, the economic prosperity precedes the Renaissance and allows it to happen. It's not a rebirth of new educational institutions. We don't see large amounts of universities being built. And so the Renaissance is not the basic institutions of Europe, right? The governments, the laws, the parliaments, the economic system, and trade. These things precede the Renaissance and date back to the Middle Ages. Both. The difference is that what makes us unique and why some historians mark this as the beginning of a course in modern European history, like our textbook, is because of the new ways of thinking.